The appearance of Jesus Christ is one of history's most debated topics, and judging by 2,000 years of Christian art, you may be picturing someone with long blonde hair, blue eyes, and tall features. However, these depictions don't exactly match the profile of a 1st century Jewish carpenter from the Middle East. So, what did Jesus actually look like, and how did we arrive at the familiar image we see today? In this video, I'm going to investigate this very question. In the first part, I'll track how Jesus' image evolved throughout the centuries, from a youthful philosopher to the bearded mystic we recognise today. In the second part, I'll explore the historical data and attempt to reconstruct Jesus' appearance based on the evidence available to us. Alright, let me show you how I pieced it together by asking the question, what did Jesus actually look like? The best place to begin with any biblical investigation is, well, the Bible, a collection of sacred writings which include the earliest accounts of the life of Jesus. Surprisingly, the Christian Gospels say next to nothing about Jesus' physical appearance. However, there is one New Testament passage that describes Jesus, although it's rather strange. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. This image is downright apocalyptic, and that's exactly how it was intended. But it does offer us a glimpse of his ultimate divine form. The only other clue about Jesus' appearance comes from a small line in the Old Testament book of Isaiah. In a description about the so-called suffering servant, he offers this image, but it's not exactly flattering. He had no beauty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. If this is a reference to Jesus, as many Christians believe, then what are we to make of it? Of course, it could simply imply that Jesus wasn't a looker, but perhaps the passage suggests that he simply looked ordinary. All in all, the Bible says very little about Jesus' appearance. Of course, it's understandable. The Bible is more focused on what Jesus said and did, and not on what he looked like. But it's always good to put a face to a name. After all, that's exactly what the earliest Christians did. Given the absence of any full description of Jesus, it's surprising to see how so many images of him share the same look. However, this image is not native to the Bible. So how did we end up with the image we see today? To answer that, we're going to have to go back in time to the earliest Christian communities. Some of the first depictions of Jesus were not of a person, but of a fish, known as the ichthus. This shape acted as a kind of code among Christians. At a time when believers faced persecution by the Romans, they needed discrete ways to identify one another. The ichthus acted as a secret password and referenced one of Jesus' well-known sayings, that his disciples should be, quote, fishers of men. The first figurative pieces of Jesus come from the Roman catacombs. Many of them depict a man carrying a ram around his shoulders. The figure appears to be a youth with short hair and no beard, and he's adorned in simple robes. Images like these were widespread and are collectively referred to as the Good Shepherd. There's some uncertainty about whether this image is meant to resemble Jesus or be a symbolic representation of him. You see, this motif predates Christianity and was a well-known image used to depict gods or heroic figures. What seems to have happened is that early Christians adapted this familiar image, allowing them to express their faith in plain sight. The first image we can confidently say is Jesus comes from the Dura Europos church in Syria. Now, it may be hard to make out, but Jesus is the figure at the top, once again depicted as a young man with robes. Below him is a man rising up. This scene appears to depict a miracle of Jesus, the healing of the paralytic, as described in Mark's Gospel. Across some of the earliest pieces of Christian art, Jesus was envisioned as a young man. He's almost unrecognizable compared to the Jesus we see today, but in the centuries to come, all that was about to change. By the mid-4th century, Christianity had been adopted by the Roman Empire and began to flourish openly. Images of Jesus now appeared in churches and basilicas and started to depict him as a bearded man with long flowing hair. One of the most famous examples is this icon from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, Dating to the 6th century, it is one of the oldest surviving icons of Jesus, portraying him with a beard and a long centre-parted hairstyle. Now, observers have noticed an intriguing detail. Each side of his face appears slightly different. This asymmetry is a subtle way to reflect the theological debates at the time, and was a way to represent Jesus as being both fully God and fully man. Images like these are a steep departure to what came before. So what happened? The portrait of a bearded Jesus once again draws from Greco-Roman iconography. In the later Roman period, having a long hair and beard were symbols of divine power. For example, many Greco-Roman gods like Zeus were depicted with long luxurious manes and thick beards. Of course, early Christians wanted to present their god using similar artistic conventions. And so this image developed as a way to convey Jesus' divinity. Centuries pass, and Christianity continued to grow, particularly among the kingdoms of Western Europe. By the medieval era, the look of Jesus was largely fixed, from the flat icon-like images of Gothic art to the vivid realism of the Renaissance. In these years, Jesus continued to be portrayed in increasingly lifelike ways, each emphasizing the humanity and suffering of the figure. Of course, in a time when most people were illiterate, visual art became the primary means of communicating the life of Jesus and the Christian teachings that came with it. As artistic movements spread beyond Italy and into Northern Europe, the image of Jesus began to change once more. In these regions, he was increasingly depicted with lighter features. Of all the portrayals throughout history, it's this northern version that's proven to be the most enduring. One of the most iconic examples is Warner Salmon's 1940 portrait, which presents Jesus with a fair complexion. It's a serene image that, for many, has become the default representation of Jesus today. Christianity is a global religion. Across the world, Jesus has been depicted in a variety of different cultures. For instance, the largest population of Christians today now live in China, and so it's common to find depictions of Jesus with Chinese features. Over the years, many artists have depicted scenes in local styles, with features more familiar to those of the Far East. Portraits like these show how many cultures choose to depict Jesus in ways familiar to themselves. Okay, so we've seen the evolution of Jesus' appearance, from a youthful philosopher into the one we see today. Each depiction has been shaped by generations of Christians over the years, and while they are all valid expressions, there was only one historical context, Roman Judea in the 1st century AD, and that's where we turn to now. Alright, so what do we know about Jesus, historically speaking? Well, it's common knowledge that he was a Jewish man who lived in Roman-occupied Judea during the 1st century. As such, it stands to reason that he would have looked more Middle Eastern than Western art makes out. Because we don't have any DNA evidence of Jesus, scientists have instead looked at the remains of people in that era. One result is a computer-generated facial reconstruction created for a BBC documentary in 2003. The model shows a man with short hair, olive skin, and a weathered expression. At the time, the image sparked controversy, especially because it looked vastly different from the traditional Western depictions of Jesus. The image was often mistaken to be a definitive portrait of Jesus, but in reality, it's based on the skull of an anonymous man, just from the same time and region. Whilst an image like this gives us a useful approximation, we'll need to go deeper to look for answers. I believe there's more evidence out there. So what I want to attempt is to reconstruct Jesus based on the evidence that we do have, starting with typical features of Jewish men at the time, and then layering in specific details that we are able to gather from the historical figure himself. While the Bible doesn't explicitly say what Jesus might have looked like, reading closely into the text, we can gain a couple of implicit details. In one of the most iconic scenes in the Bible, the betrayal of Jesus, Judas Iscariot identifies Jesus to the guards with a kiss. Now, the fact that Judas needed to identify Jesus suggests that he didn't stand out physically from the disciples. After all, he needed to be pointed out. This reveals a unique detail, that Jesus would have looked like the average 1st century Jew. These groups traditionally have olive-toned skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. What's more, based on human remains found from the region, the average male height would have been considerably shorter from today. If Jesus was of typical height, he would have been around 5'5", quite different from the tall, slender figure often depicted in Western art. Alright, we're now beginning to form a fuller profile of Jesus, based on what we can reasonably guess about the people of his time. But now it's time for one of his most iconic features, his hair. Of course, it's hard to know Jesus' actual grooming regime, but as a practicing Jew, he would have almost certainly worn his beard, as prescribed in the law of Moses. Supporting this are a series of Roman coins issued after the capture of Jerusalem in 70 AD. On them, they depict Jewish men, each sporting beards that are trimmed and shortened. As for hair length, well, there's not much to go on. However, a brief line from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians hints that there was a cultural expectation for men to not have long hair. This suggests that if Jesus followed these norms, he would have likely had short hair. The final piece of the puzzle is clothing. So, what would he have worn? It's likely that Jesus would have owned simple garments, typical of a lower-class Jewish tekton, or carpenter. Based on historical dress codes, his clothing would have included a knee-high tunic, known as a chiton, and over it an outer robe, known as a hemation. Oh, and he probably wore leather sandals, which was the most common footwear of the era. At this point, I've gathered a profile of the average Jewish man at the time, based on reasonable historical assumptions and some biblical references here and there. With it, I've created a surprisingly detailed appearance of Jesus, although purely hypothetical of course. And there's one problem. At the moment, it's word soup. So, just for fun, I decided to input my full description into an image generator, and what it came up with was this. What we're looking at is a man, clearly of Semitic origin. This person has many of the details referenced so far. Of course, this image isn't truly Jesus, it's just an AI interpretation based on my research, and so shouldn't be taken as gospel. That said, I think this is a fair approximation. It gives us an insight into what Jesus could have looked like, based on historical data we have available to us. AI-generated art remains a debated topic, especially when it comes to religious figures like Jesus. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts here. Does this technology offer us a fresh way to visualize Jesus, or does it risk becoming a distraction? Let me know down in the comments. Did Jesus have blonde Scandinavian locks? Probably not. Does it truly matter? Well, up to you. What Jesus may have looked like historically is indeed a fascinating question, but ultimately, most Christians are interested in what he said rather than how he looked. That said, we humans are visual creatures. We have a biological desire to connect with other faces. And the same is true for figures of worship. And that's why depicting Jesus has been such an important part of church history. It allows followers another way to connect with the divine. Of course, most modern images of Jesus have been influenced by Roman and medieval art, which has shaped our mental image of how Jesus should look. And so, when confronted with something different, it's, well, jarring. So, what does Jesus actually look like? Well, nowadays a lot of things, from short hair to long hair, from Western to Eastern. Each image tells a different story and allows different people to understand the figure of Jesus in a new, original way. Over this journey, there's one item that you may have noticed I haven't mentioned, the Turin Shroud, believed by some to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It allegedly bears the imprint of his face. I've chosen to leave it out of this discussion, as it remains one of the most controversial and debated relics in Christianity, and many question its authenticity. That said, I want to do this topic justice, so I'd like to explore it in a future video. But if you are curious for a short overview, do check out my video on dark Christian relics, along with an array of other curious artifacts found throughout Christian history. Watch here to find out more. Hey, thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this one. If you like this video and want to see more, why not subscribe? A like and a comment also go a really long way. My recent videos have gone out to a new audience, and so welcome aboard for the ride. The channel is now at over 900,000 subscribers. Goodness me, we're getting close to a pretty big milestone. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.